See if I can get this up. All right, we'll do the little intro video.
And when you're doing the thing, should it be looking out this way or at you? How do you work the
Either
camera?
way.
You don't care.
Doesn't
Okay.
matter.
Right.
Whatever you're comfortable with.
Oh.
Oh, we don't need to do 58-second countdown. We'll just skip right to the. We'll skip closer. We'll do the little intro video for posterity. Should be good.
Two, one, go.
Yeah, I can dance on it. Okay, welcome to our live taping of Writer Mother Monster. For anyone who's new to the podcast, Writer Mother Monster is a community and a conversation series devoted to breaking down the myth of having it all and offering solidarity, support, and advice to other creative mothers and parents more generally, but specifically mothers. So our guest tonight is Mary Collins, and in a second I'll introduce Mary. But first, this is a live recording. It is streamed on Facebook and YouTube, and it will be archived after the fact as a video and audio podcast on all major platforms. So welcome, and thank you to the Stonington Free Library and to Millie for hosting us. It's very exciting. Yay! This is only our second live taping, so I'm sure there will be some little glitches, but stick with us and we'll work through them.
Yeah.
And now this is Mary Collins. Mary Collins. So I'll read Mary's bio to you. So, and I should have put this in here. So Mary, 1 second before we
Sure. Yeah.
do this, which is embarrassing. Remind me how old your child is.
Donald is now 31.
Thank you. All right. Here we are in action. Okay, so Mary Collins. After many years in Washington, D.C., working as a writer and editor for National Geographic and the Smithsonian, Mary Collins returned to her native Connecticut to accept a position as a professor of nonfiction for the creative writing minors at Central Connecticut State University. In the last 15 years, she has spearheaded the development of the writing and publishing minor, supervised many community engagement projects, and won the CCSU Teaching Award. She is an active writer of literary nonfiction and has published 3 books since arriving at Central in 2007. You can find them all out front after the event, and many articles and essays as well. Her most recent title, a playbook, Creating Writers, Creating Citizens, came out in 2023. Mary has 1 child, aged 31, and describes writer motherhood in 3 words as hold on to yourself. So Mary, let's start there. Tell us about those 3 words.
Hold on to yourself. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm honored. Be sure to go to the website because there's some terrific podcasts on there. And I had a great time sorting through them before I came today. And thanks to all of you for coming on a gorgeous afternoon. So hold on to yourself. I had the unusual situation of having a baby when I was 31, and the father walked. So I was a single parent. I didn't have a lot of money. I had already started my career as a reporter and writer, and I had wanted to really stick with it. And I wanted to also be home with my baby. So I lived with a sibling for about almost 2 years and just dropped my whole career, which at the time was really popping. I had published a book on National Public Radio, and I've been working at some really great places. And I remember my mother, when I got offered a job as an editor. A lot of women get offered jobs as editors and want to be writers, and it's really tempting because the editing jobs usually pay and they're consistent work. And I got offered a job actually up at the Harvard Women's Health Newsletters, and they offered free childcare, and I turned it down. And I remember coming back and afraid to tell my mother, who'd been so helpful. And she said, hold on to yourself. And at the time, I didn't fully understand what she was saying, but she was saying, despite all these challenges, don't let go of yourself. because you will come to resent the situation and your child. So if you want to be a writer, then go figure it out. If you don't want editing to take over your whole career for all these other practical reasons. So that's
Yeah.
where that came from, was actually something my mother said to me: make sure you hold on to yourself. And it was a great turning point in my life because it felt validated about the decision.
Wow.
Mhm.
What kind of woman was your mother?
She was a hoot. She lived to 96, grew up in Rhode Island, actually, and Connecticut. But she was one of the first group of women in the military. She was in the waves in World War II. And so for her in the Great Depression to ask her very blue collar dad, who had been a lumberman, who then worked in paper mills, I want to join the military. And he's like, women don't do that. And she couldn't join without his permission. And my grandmother came through and said, yeah, she's going, because I didn't have the life I wanted. And Connie, my mother's name, deserves that. And I think that's where she learned to hold on to herself. When she went off to Washington, which were in the Depression, someone from Pawtucket never had left the town, was like, huge. And it paid for her college education. When she got out, she learned to draft maps. She met my father in Boston, and her whole life opened up because her mother had advocated for her holding on to herself. And I learned that later and came to understand why that my mother had said that to me, because it had been generationally such a huge thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems like it's pretty rare for women of that generation to have that perspective, right?
Hugely rare. And my
Yeah.
mother got very involved in politics in the state of Connecticut. And she was head of the Republican in the 50s and 60s. Today they would not be that, but my father was an Irish Catholic running for Congress, and the Irish Democrats didn't want him. They wanted him to wait. And he's like, well, I don't want to wait. So they just were like, well, fine. And they lost all the time. And they ran around, but they got very involved. So they were very civically involved from a very young age. My mother always cared about that. She taught, she had 8 brothers and sisters, 4 kids. I had 50 first cousins.
Oh my God.
Yep. And so my Uncle Tommy had 15 kids, So these women in my life had always figured out how to keep a hold of who they were, despite the responsibilities that I think are often unique to women and
Mhm.
remain that way even as our society changes. My mother never lost track of her love of politics and being involved, and they were deeply involved. My father became a judge in the state of Connecticut, actually, and they both came from nothing. My father was orphaned and raised in
Oh.
Hartford by he was orphaned because his mother died when he was young of scarlet fever. So they both came from nothing, and a lot of times when that happens, you're always worried about money.
Mhm.
And writers worry about money, understandably. And
Mhm.
what I thought was the greatest thing they modeled for me was, even coming from nothing, they never let financial decisions rule every aspect of their life. Like, it has to do, but they always had a portion of their life that they owned, even as they met the responsibilities.
Mhm.
And I ended up modeling that pattern in my creative work.
Ooh, let's go into that. So tell us,
Yeah.
well, let's start with having your child. So
Oh,
did you always
yeah.
want to be a mother? Or tell us about
Yes,
this
I
journey.
did.
Okay.
In fact, I wish I'd had 2 or 3 kids. It just didn't play out that way. But and I do actually personally believe in a woman's right to choose. But I had been raised in a Catholic environment, so when I was pregnant, it never entered my mind not to have the baby. But I think it's a totally personal decision and nobody's business. And so everyone around me that was in my professional life told me that's a bad idea. So my very first book was a history of National Public Radio that I had been given as a big journalism assignment. That was 25 years of NPR with lots of photographs. And I was afraid to tell them I was pregnant. I was afraid for sure they would pull the project. And I desperately needed the money. And it was my first big project as a writer. So I told them I had the flu, because of course I had some morning sickness. And then as I started feeling better later, and they realized I was pregnant, they always called my child Flu. I thought this was the greatest, funniest thing. Yeah. So that was just a huge challenge. But I moved to Baltimore instead of Washington, D.C., where I had all my clients, because Baltimore was much cheaper to live in. And I had some really rough years. I mean, I didn't have any money. My family lived in other places. But I don't know. It's like I was reading Amy Shern's book, and what's the first again, Edna Sloan?
Dear Edna Sloan.
Dear Edna
Yep.
Sloan, I want to plug that because in one
Yes.
moment in Amy Sheeran's book, also by Redhead Press, which publishes Laura's beautiful work, the narrator talks about, well, how can you go through life not wanting to do your art, which we were just looking at your beautiful art. Like, I can't imagine my life without having that driving a portion of my life. And it's like a seed in you that just never goes away. And some people have it and some don't. And in Amy's book, she sort of can't even imagine the life without that. So even though I had the child and the single parent and the pressure of the money, I was like, okay. My first project was called The Essential Daughter, Changing Expectations for Girls at Home. That was my first book where it was my idea, and I wrote it and I sold it. And it's because I was stuck at home and I had to do a project. It was based on the American Girl series, but instead of fiction, I found real letters of girls, and I did a historical portrait of changing expectations via their letters of girls at home, because I was at home with, at the time, my own daughter, now my trans son, but at the time, my own daughter. And so that was an example of the kind of adjustments that you make without losing track of what it is you really want to be doing.
Which can be so easy to do, even now. I mean, maybe more so, although it's debatable. I think, back in your mother's generation, my mother's generation, she gave up her career aspirations when she became a mother, and I think that's always haunted her and reinforced for me the idea of holding on to myself.
Did she ever verbalize that to you as a child?
She did, yes.
Did that affect you?
It did.
Well, that's really
Yeah,
interesting.
It did.
In not a negative way, it just
I would say probably in a negative way.
Yeah,
in
that's
some
interesting.
ways. For a long time, I thought I didn't want to ever be a mother for that reason, because I
Yeah.
wanted so badly to be a writer, and I didn't see models when I was growing up of creatives who were women and mothers. So
That's
yeah.
amazing. And do you have siblings?
I do. I have a sister. She's also a writer. She's an
Oh my
editor at Rolling
goodness.
Stone. And
Oh my
yeah,
gosh, that's so
yeah,
fascinating. So you both
we
broke
both
out of
did.
that environment
Mhm.
where you could have felt contained, but chose to
did.
be released by that feeling of, I don't want
Yes.
that. I want this other
Mhm.
thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she always said that she never regretted becoming a mother, but you can tell when someone regrets the things that they've sacrificed, right?
It's
The
true.
things they've left behind.
My
So
mother wisely said that. Don't
yeah.
resent your baby. Be sure you
Mhm.
live your life.
Yep.
And
And I would say I
I
never felt
understood that.
like I was resented, but
Mhm.
yeah, I think
I
that's
think it's a
so
huge
important.
factor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy now, I have to say, because I modeled in my own life, which you must be doing for your lovely daughter here. She's also already a writer and an artist.
Yes.
Donald, my only child now, my trans son, previously my daughter, is also just very creative driven. And so he is doing practical things, but he never lets go of his artistic self. And it's saved him in very hard times as a person transitioning from female to male. The artistic side of him was the deeper side, and it gave him the tools to communicate complexity. And as in the case of all writing and art, you end up having a conversation with an imaginary person that you want to. I mean, I found being a single parent very lonely. I was stuck at home a lot, and I had no help and couldn't go anywhere without someone in tow, and it was very lonely. And so the writing was a way to be like, well, I'm speaking to the people that I wish were in the room. And then Donald, I think, learned that from me, because he then began to speak to the people he wished was in the room. Because 15 years ago, no one had heard of the term transgender, and he was the first in his high school to ever come out. So imagine the sense of isolation where nobody even had that vocabulary, never mind the challenge of what he was feeling. And his art was huge, that he was been given permission all his life, that was an okay thing to be pursuing in your life. And I have a great passion for that in my classes.
Yes. Oh, and I want to come back to Donald and to teaching in a few minutes, but let's stick for a second with those early years where you have a small child and you're writing and you're struggling financially, which I think I can certainly relate to, right? So how
Scary.
logistically, yes, it's
Very
scary. How did you actually logistically write in that place of sort of fear and having all of this going on and caretaking for a small child and being a single parent without family nearby? How did you get the work done?
No, that's really a good question. I had been a serious athlete, so I'd always been a very disciplined person. So when I had, I'll call him Donald, even though it was my daughter at the time, but Donald's the name he prefers. So I had Donald at home when he was young. I was lucky, and in the beginning of the internet at the time, I told you how old I am. I was one of the first to be getting freelance work at home that I could do on my computer, and Time Life Books hired me to put together an entire encyclopedia on skin ailments.
Oh no.
Okay, so like dermatitis, whatever, eczema, and they paid me good money. So I taught myself how to use the Johns Hopkins Medical Library, got a little house apartment in Baltimore, and got a daycare provider in the house because I didn't want my little baby having a daycare yet. And so I worked for money in the morning. And then when my Donald would go to sleep at night, I worked on my work. And it was the only way I could do my own work. And so even though The Essential Daughter Changing Expectations for Girls at Home is a very flawed first book, it's my favorite book. Because when I got that book done and I found an agent and I got a publisher with Prager, and it actually happened despite the circumstances of my life, it was incredibly validating that I had held on to myself. And so every time I see that book in my bookshelf, I'm always like, you hung in there. Right? And it's very validating. Another reason to be keeping hard books. I have a whole bookcase of books of people that I know, and I've gone to their reading. And for each of them, it has been such a validating moment to have published a book. It's never easy. Every book is a precious, amazing thing. And so I have this whole bookcase of people having that victorious moment. And that's it. It's like 30 years of authors like yourself. Your book is in it. Laura's book is there. A victorious moment as a mother and a writer, writing a fabulous book, by the way. Buy that book. It's great. It influenced me greatly, actually. It freed me up to read it because it was so original. And so those kind of books are in the case, and that's the only reason why they're there, is these people had pursued their vision, whatever it is. So some people end up with lots of books, but it doesn't matter. Each one of them, you're like, no way. It happens, right?
I love that you have a bookcase devoted.
I do just
to
for that.
That's amazing.
I wrote an essay about it.
Did you?
Yeah, I did. It did. I have to add that I won a big award, and I love this essay, and it's called The Bookcase. My father died when I was 14, which was one reason why we didn't end up having a lot of money. My mother was amazing, and amazing, paid for college and everything. So she gave me his legal bookcase. So I have that bookcase. And as a writer, I slowly filled it only with books of people I know. They have to be signed. I have to have gone to the reading. And now, 30 years in, it's full. So I wrote an essay about what are the inscriptions? What are people saying when they give me the book? And it's not about what's inside the book or if I like the book. It's the miracle of the book. And many of them are mothers. Many of them. Many of them are people that had 4 kids, 5 kids, got divorced, one kid, kid with disabilities. I have people with disability kids. And it's like a Victoria's Too Special section shelf of like moms who got their books done, and you don't see those patterns until you actually think of the idea. I'm going to write an essay about the books in this case. And then I started looking at the inscriptions and I was like, wow, there's a pattern here. I mean, there's a whole pattern of former lovers and, there's like a whole section, you're like, I'm loving this. This is right. But there's a mom section.
Wow.
You're in the mom section. Yeah.
Where is this essay? Where can we read the essay?
It was in a review called the Potomac Review, which still comes out. I now just recently made a PDF file of some of my essays I really do like. And I put them up on my website just this summer.
Okay.
So
great.
it is up there because even though it's an older essay, I've always liked that essay.
Yeah.
Because it remains why we're in the library, right? Also.
Yeah.
Like you can have everything digitally, but when you're here, walking upstairs in particular, again, each of those books is a victory of some sort.
Yes. For anyone listening at home or to the audio later, we are in the Stonington Free Library right in the middle of Stonington Borough. And upstairs, there is a glass floored walkway with a poet's corner, and it's just the most beautiful building. So Mary was referencing the upstairs that we took a little tour of right before the event. So if you haven't been to this library, please come visit, and Stonington Borough as well. But let's go back to Donald now
Yes.
and tell us a little
Yes.
bit more about Donald. And I know this is his story to tell,
Yes.
but you and he collaborated on a book. So maybe you could tell us a bit about what
Yeah.
it was like mothering a child going through that transition and that trauma, we'll call
Yes,
it.
and the other part too is, what does it mean to write about people you know, right? And so if you're writing about your family, it could be children,
Mhm.
and the kind of permission that you need. Donald had not shown signs young that he was going to have this gender transition. But when it hit about age 15, it hit hard and big. And so that's sort of the quick summary of, I was just trying to figure out why my very intelligent, artistic, lovely child, never been a problem, just a lovely, was just going off the rails. And and what happened was, they had a big brother little sister program, or and at his school, and he's like, I don't want to be a big sister, I want to be a big brother. And I was like, well, you can't, you're a girl. And he's like, well, and so he cut his hair and changed his clothes and said, now I want to be a big brother. So we went through this very traumatic time, because I had never heard of that, and I didn't know what to do with that. And because we were a single parent family, I did get married eventually, but my ex had a drinking problem. So I went back to being a single parent again. We were just the two of us, every day, all the time, very linked. And it was really difficult. And who came to save the day? Not professionals, not teachers, certainly not the school, which never even talked to me, but my mother, my conservative Republican, old New England, Great Depression, Rhode Island, nuts, bolts, no nonsense mother was like, this is your kid. They want to go to the men's department to get clothes. It's not going to change. Get over it. And then turned to Donald and said, your mother's grieving the daughter she had. You have to have more compassion. Love her. And my mother was this amazing mediator in this family situation. Fast forwarding to the writing aspect of processing your life through writing. And so I wrote an essay called Mapping Modern Grief. I had found letters from my Irish ancestors where their daughter had gone overseas in 1889, somewhere right in there, and they knew she would never return. And they were like, we are in our old age and your brother has died and you've left us here alone in Ireland to go to America. And the letters were found behind a frame in one of my aunt's house, and they were so moving. And I could relate so much to this idea that you've sent someone away and they may never come back. So I wrote an essay about that feeling as it related to my daughter becoming a man. And I showed it to Donald, which was an enormous risk. I didn't do it to make him feel bad. I was trying to make him understand why I was struggling. And he was amazing. We had some tough, 2 years to receive that. And then I said, I think we should use writing to process what's going on. And he wasn't ready. I said, fine. So respecting the people in your lives and your children in your family, if it turns out that you're writing about them, hopefully we can talk about some of those issues, writing about people writing about difficult topics. I teach workshops on that a lot. A year later, he reached out and said, we never got back to the space that we had, and I miss that. So I am going to write. And he wrote his pieces and I wrote mine, and we didn't edit a word of each other. And we didn't share opinion. We only shared stories. This is how I experienced what happened. And we put this book together, again, totally like, what? Like, we're not really thinking about markets or ancient and nothing. And I teach at Yale in the summer, and someone I knew there who used to run the MFA program at University of Michigan, Eileen Polak, great writer, great book about being the only woman in the room at Yale. She said, I think this press, Beacon Press, would love it. So we had a lucky strike. Usually you're going to agents and waiting forever. Literally, Eileen Polak introduced us. I dropped the book proposal over and said, we're pretty much done. What do you think? Oh, we just had a meeting and said we're dying for the student, the child parent perspective, and we don't have any parent perspective. We'll take it. So we sold the book to a major publisher in like 2 days, which was, totally a fluke. And so I didn't even have to use an agent for that project. I am so glad we did the project. And then we hit the road as guest speakers, and Donald is a hoot. He's a riot. He's so funny. I mean, I'm like nothing. He's so
No, I was
funny.
going to say, I wonder where he gets that
Oh
from.
my God, he's so funny. And we started doing even the medical school, which I mentioned earlier, like Yale and Cornell, because the residents wanted to learn about how to handle the families. Oh, he was like a stand-up comedy routine. And then he got tired of doing it, and he found stress, and he didn't want to identify just as trans anymore. And now he's getting a doctorate in film and media studies, and he doesn't want to deal with the book anymore. And the key is to give permission. Like, of course, we're done. That's fine. Yeah, it's good. It served its purpose. It's over. And so then you also always have to think about, well, if you're writing about your child at a certain time, 10 years from now, that's not going to be them. And that's not going to be you as the mother. Like, I was often attacked as the mother in the book, but who I am now, 15 years later, is not who I am in the book. Like, that was what was happening then. You have to accept that if you choose to share your story with others. Those are unique challenges for writers, I think, and parents in particular, writing about their families. Have you ever written about your family?
I was just thinking about this as you were talking. The book that I just finished writing, haven't shared it yet, is a memoir, and it's about sort of really briefly, it's about how we form desire and how that's played out in my life and in my marriage, and sort of the idea of nostalgia and regret and thinking about all of these things, which was terrifying to write because I am happily married, and I've been married for 20 years, and my daughter's 8, and my husband is a major character in this book, as is my daughter, as is a boy I had a crush on when I was young and reconnected with a few years ago. And so I just gave it to my husband to read, and he's been reading it the last few days, like next to me in bed. And
That's
it's
amazing.
terrifying. Oh, it's so scary.
No, it is terrifying to share. But so
yes.
how did you approach both your young daughter and your husband about permission?
Yeah.
How did you handle that?
Well, I'm lucky, I think, that my husband is a very literary person. He manages Bank Square Books here in Mystic. So he is a big reader. He loves complexity. He is fully supportive of me as a writer. And he and I had lots of conversations as I was writing. So I think it was never a question of
So what about your daughter?
My daughter,
she's young.
Is young, and mostly the parts about her so far are about myself being pregnant. So it was more my story of motherhood.
Yeah.
With her as a character, but not getting too much into her.
Right. So you have
life.
this need as a writer to be honest, and as a mother to be protective.
Yes.
It's a very, very unique dynamic in writing, to be very, very sheltering, and yet it won't work if you don't have a raw candor to it.
Yes.
And so that's really cool that you've been navigating that and now sharing it. Wow, that's so scary. Yeah.
Did you, as you were writing your section,
Terrified.
Did you?
Because we had finally reached like a copacetic kind of cool place. And then I'm like, here's my essays. I thought it would blow up in our face. But I was willing to take the risk because, like Donald, I felt like there was still a wall, and it's because we hadn't fully shared with each other, and the project allowed that movement forward. And he agreed it was a good idea in the long run, but very scary because these are the people closest to you. But how interesting that when you write or draw, you just get driven by a topic, and you can be taking great risks. And I was really surprised recently. I was reading David Sedaris's most recent book, and I knew that he'd had a very conflicted relationship with his father as a child who was gay, and the father didn't really accept him. And there's been sort of a snarky, humorous part of in a lot of his essays. But in the recent book, he's not, and the father is dying, he's in a hospital room, and he just blasts him. He doesn't hold back at all. He just talks about how terrible he was. And you could tell that he had held back for 20 years. And then in the most recent book, as a son-father combo, some switch went off. And you do have to watch it, because when I read the book, I thought, no, this is too angry. And when I sent my essays to Beacon, that was the other thing that's really helpful, is to listen to editors, because as a mother, it's so close to me. they help me with tone.
Mm.
They like, you can't see it, but this is too angry here. You can't understand it, but this is too angry here. And they had to show me. I couldn't see it. And that's where an editor can be such a valuable, when you're writing something that close to the bone, like with your
Yes.
memoir.
Yes. And I
Mm.
want to get into editing and teaching too in a second, but I want to stay here for a moment and just ask for anybody out there listening, or for you folks, if anyone is writing about a topic that feels risky and scary, did you have to, as you were writing, sort of pretend that no one would ever read it? Or did
Definitely.
you write it as if you were writing to Donald?
I wrote it like I pretended no one would ever read it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm lying. I wrote it, brought it to a writing workshop with some really advanced writers, and they were like, "What? We didn't find out you have a trans son till page 18 in this essay? What are you hiding?" And I was like, "Well, I didn't really want to talk about that." And they're like, "Page 18." And then I returned to page 18 and I thought, well, that's right. It is on page 18. So my very first attempt, I had huge walls up and it was hiding like crazy.
Yeah.
And they were like, that's what's good about having outside editors. They called me on it and I was like, they're right.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the outside opinion, whether it's an editor or a teacher. And you've been a professor for many years
Yeah.
now, and I know it's one of the great loves of your life.
Yeah.
Tell us actually really quickly about your most recent book, which is beautiful.
It's quirky.
It's quirky in the best
weird.
possible way. So tell us the elevator pitch of
So
that.
very quick on a playbook, creating writers, creating citizens. After coming out of COVID, I was not feeling creative at all. I had spent my whole life doing projects for hire and books. I had like 6 books and 5 young adult books and was just tired. And I thought, I need to do something fun, which is what you're doing with your beautiful art. So I picked up watercolor and I just started painting things that give me joy. And it turned to a lot of things from my childhood, like a toboggan or a canoe. And then when I started doing that, I started writing flash nonfiction pieces, and I could cared less about whether I ever published this thing. I was just doing it to uncork my creative sensibility again and to bring joy back into my writing. But as I pondered it, I realized my own students had lost the capacity for play and joy because of the society that we're living in. And they increasingly, in about 5-year increments, increasingly came in incapable of doing exercises that I had done just 5 years earlier about creative thinking, because they had not been exposed to playing freely as a child. So I started doing some serious research for a different book, and I included it in this one. So it ended up having a sort of serious backcurrent, like what I'm seeing in my classes is affecting their capacity to be creative thinkers, independent thinkers, and then that's where the citizen side of it came in, because I was like, I thought this was just going to be a playful, fun book, but boy, it's brought me to this very intense place. And it was a total wreck of a book. And I hired someone named Laura, which is how I met her.
Yeah.
I read her book. Again, it's up there and read it, from Redhead Pen. And I was like, okay, this is one of the most original writing pieces, collections I've read in a long time. And this person didn't get an MFA. This person is so out there. And I thought, I'm going to contact her, which is how we met, and show her this kooky project and tell her, you're a better writer than I am at what this kind of more experimental work. What's wrong with my project? I'll pay you to be my editor just to give it a one-time read. And it's the only reason why the project ever finished, because she was like, yeah, a third of this is terrible, a third of it's good, and a third of it's
put it that way.
is excellent. You know, so you got something going here, but like this part is no. And I was like, okay. And you know, I needed someone with a more literary mindset because I'm such a practical nonfiction. I mean, I always kept hold of that because I make a living as a reporter. And so getting that outside read was huge for that project, and it's a very unusual project.
It is a wonderful project.
Well,
and
thank you.
And thank you for the kind words.
Oh, yeah.
But
there's a cow on the cover, okay? That's how serious that book is.
So it is a very playful,
Yes.
intentionally playful,
Yeah.
Joyous book about writing and teaching and our
Yeah.
sense of play.
Very
and,
personal.
And it's very personal.
Yeah. And a small, I was so happy I didn't worry about it, but then a small I knew a bunch of people at small presses, and a small press in DC that publishes poetry.
Mhm.
Ed Perlman, I had met him when I taught at Johns Hopkins. I just on a lark sent him a couple of the pieces, and he's like, "I love this." And I was like, "Well, it's weird." And he's like, "Well, you got to let me put a cow on the cover, and then I'll publish it." And I was like, "Okay." Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the cow is because I don't know if you've ever been to Thorncrest Chocolates. I forgot what town they're in around here. But the woman who runs it, they have their own cows and they make only milk chocolate basically. And the woman is such a world-renowned taster that she can tell you which cow's cow milk went into a piece of chocolate. So there's Daisy the cow and Daydream. So you can give her a piece of chocolate and she'll say, "Oh yeah, that's Daydream. That's Daydream's milk." And so I try to show my students, imagine having that refined level of understanding about language. So I have a class where they taste the chocolates. I asked them, "Can you tell Daydream?" And they're like, "No." And I was like, "Well, that shows you that there's something missing, that you can't taste it." Well, that's what happens when your sentences are off. You just can't see it yet. I drew an analogy. Oh, it's such a stretch. What a kooky exercise this is. Well, my friend Ed, I painted a cow in honor of Daydream the cow and the chocolates. And the fact that I do that in my classes, and he stuck it on the cover.
Yeah.
So that was the loose, crazy connection to all that.
No, let's stick with teaching for a second
Yeah.
and talk more about this. And we're here in a library, and we know literacy,
Yeah.
and with the advent of AI,
Yeah,
and
it's terrifying.
the banning of books, and all of so our sense of play and our sense of language and the importance of books and reading is. I don't think it's too strong to say it's under attack. So how
It
does that
is.
play into what you're seeing in the classroom, and
It
how
is.
can we kind of lift up books, literature, literacy? That's a big question.
It is a big question, and I think that increasingly there's such a practical mindset about learning that they're forgetting the importance of creativity and play, and a lot of the parents don't even want their children in creative writing classes, so the students hide it from their parents. I never bumped into that kind of problem before. The students come in looking for rubrics, models. So if you bring them, I bring them out on field trips, and they're like, "What are we supposed to do here?" And I'm like, "Well, you're on a sense assignment. You have to use a sense other than sight and experience this garden." And they're like, they just sit there. And 10 years ago, it was no problem. So there's something fundamentally going on in our society and in education where it is literally being cut off at the root. And you can't reteach it to them in just one semester. And so, as a person who's been teaching for 40 years, actually, I've been teaching since about 1986. The trends have been unbelievable. On a positive note, when I brought in the kooky paintings of like the cow, the students thought this was a hoot. And we had started creating zines, which are little mini magazines where they write small amounts of text and use images. They could do drawings, they can use photos. And they got really into the flexibility of it and the mix of image and text. And then I let them do audio and text. And when they started to see how the storytelling could be rounded out with audio, visual, and text, they got less intimidated by the text. And some of them produced their best work. And I also didn't grade the last assignment. So I was like, whatever. And then they had to present it. And then some of them were really doing good stuff. So there was peer pressure to come in and deliver. And all my colleagues were like, if you don't grade the last assignment before finals, those students are going to blow it off. And not one has blown that assignment off in 3 years. And it's because they care, it's fun, they're learning, they're sharing, and they're free. And that's the best thing that came out of that project is I realized I'm going to make these little zines. So it's a good news, bad news story. AI is terrifying.
Yeah.
You're going to have to accept it's there. I have a contract that if they use AI, they need my written permission. And if they use the AI, whatever material they use, they have to give me a printout of the material they use to get any kind of story started. And they can only do it for one assignment. So I'm leaving a door open for them to play with it without blocking it out. But then the consequences for using it without permission are brutal. Like I treat it as plagiarism. So I'm having to set really clear guidelines, which I'm sure everybody in this room is in some level worrying about that's all going to look like. Yeah.
I've only been teaching for 1 year at the college level, and so I don't have the historic context for the AI, and I'm seeing it in classroom.
Mhm.
And it's, I think, particularly scary when I have them write a personal essay or something that's about their own life and they're using AI.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you're seeing the same thing, where often they use it because out of fear. And
Definitely.
it's the fear of my
Definitely.
voice is not important enough or professional enough. And I don't know how to do this. And so they're using
I
the
agree
AI.
with that.
Yeah.
There was a great National Public Radio just last week, and the woman had done a book about love letters. She tracked love letters where people were doing their love letters using AI because they didn't feel confident writing good ones.
Yeah.
And she tracked them as a psychologist and showed that even though they felt more confident about the content, which was, of course, full with cliches or whatever, they never had an emotional purchase. They never summoned feeling, and it affected their relationships. And she did a whole book on it, that by not summoning the individual self to produce text and art on the page, you actually truncated something emotionally, and it actually did have an impact. And so she's working at MIT doing some pretty cool studies. And I'm going to have my students listen to 10 minutes of that hour to show having purchase and summoning the self. Like I love that you earlier said, this is my aunt, this is the couch, this is my favorite panel. I just love sitting next to you because you're like summoning the self and saying, this is my work, this is my life, this is my story. And that's incredible for someone your age that you're just doing that. It's just really exciting to see that.
Yeah, and for anyone who's listening and can't see it, we're talking about a young writer here, a young writer artist in the audience, who was showing us before the podcast started some of their work. So
Thank you for the context.
Yes, it was really beautiful.
It was really great.
And this is actually a good opportunity to invite anyone here sitting with us if they have questions or want to hear more about something specific. I can keep us moving if not, but
love to hear from everybody.
Do you have any advice for publishing a book?
Oh, good question. Mary, I'll turn it to you.
Well, we can both answer that, but I would say I had my best luck when I didn't worry about that. Because then I loved the project. I cared about what I was doing. I wasn't afraid. And then as I moved through the project and it got closer to completion, I cared about it. But in my many years of teaching, when I teach at Yale in the summer, a lot of people have books and they're moving too soon to worry about it being a book. And it can often really hold them up because they're so concerned about getting a book. And it's like, but what about fully realizing the vision of what you're doing? And then the book just happens. It comes. Like that's my impression is that you can have some hard times where you wait forever to get a yes, but the book itself, if you've vested in it, will find a home. And so stay in that invested self part, not the book and the agents. And I mean, I know people who just go from workshop to workshop and agents and pitching to agents, and they actually never get anywhere because they're so taking up too much energy. How about yourself on that question?
Oh yeah, no, I agree with you completely. So I have a creative writing center over at the Velvet Mill for anyone who's looking for this type of workshop or advice. But so I hear that question a lot from people who walk in and they're usually of two minds. One person has a story that they're dying to tell, and they're just trying to figure out how to tell the story, and they're not thinking about publishing. And the other half of folks come in ready to write a book, but they don't have a story usually. So it's usually one of
That's
one
really
or
insightful.
the other, right?
Yes.
And so I tell those who are concerned about the publishing the book, and I say, well, why? Why do you want to publish a book?
Yeah.
And in a second, I'm going to ask you that question.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the one answer that I try to steer people away from is when they say, I want to publish a book and live off of my royalties. And I say, oh God, no. It's like, if you're in it for the money, I just like, sure, you should, I'm not going to discourage someone from writing, but I will discourage folks from writing for that reason. Because it does happen for very few folks, but very few. So I tend to start with, why do you want to write this book? Or why do you want to write a book? So let's ask you, why do you want to write a book?
Well, it depends on which book, because I've got so many. But like this particular book that I'm trying to publish, it's just like kind of to get me started But as I was saying earlier, it was inspired by someone in my
Mhm.
family.
Yeah, that's cute. That's funny.
But so that's why, and like it's hard to write the book out of the context of that person, like just to look at it as a story and not like, like kind of a revenge against that person.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to like kind of get a book out there to get myself going, and then I can work on like bigger projects in the future.
But you said
Yeah.
something really insightful earlier, that you actually like short story, and that you like that that's a goal that's smaller and more manageable and can still get your stuff out there. A lot of times editors troll good journals looking for short stories and then ask the people. Beach City by Diaz, they ended up tracking her down. They loved it. It was a short little piece, and then she got a novel contract out of that. So, I like that idea that you work with these units, smaller units. I didn't get into the book mindset, until I was probably, I don't know, in a serious way, like mid 30s, late 30s. And then because I'm a nonfiction, so my books are based on things that are true. It was a little bit more money oriented, because it was a piece of my business. I was writer, editor, and work for hire, and then my own stuff. But
Oh,
I
yeah.
think, short stories, I love short stories, so writing good short stories is great. I'm not convinced that, especially with the changes in the market, that a book is to always be even your goal.
No, yeah. And I think
Yeah.
to backtrack a little bit of what I said before,
Yeah.
I was much like you when I was around your age, where I wanted to be an author. That's all I've ever wanted to be, was a writer, and I wanted to write books. And I had, as you sort of articulated, a lot of stories that I wanted to tell. But at the end of the day, that was the path I knew I wanted to pursue. So I think you're thinking about it in such a smart way of both dreaming of a goal, having a book, but also some
Yeah.
practical steps to get there, of
Yeah.
writing shorter
Yeah.
pieces.
Yeah.
Um,
Good.
yeah. And I'm
Yeah.
hearing you say um, that you're maybe a little hesitant about writing about the person that you're thinking about. So I think, going back to what we were saying before, if you can kind of imagine that no one will ever read
Yeah.
it
Yeah. And free
for
yourself.
a while until it's done,
Yeah.
and then you can
Yeah.
think about the publishing, and then the fear can come in after you've written the book.
Can we come back to you for a minute,
Sure.
though, with your mom? And so we've got the mother-daughter
Yes.
relationship at the core of what we're talking about a lot today. And how did she handle that? Did she see the fact that you were interested in writing a lot as just something you were goofing around with? Did she see the seriousness of it? And it sounds like also in your sister.
Mhm.
How did that whole dynamic happen?
Interestingly,
And your dad too, not just
yeah.
moms, but
No,
yeah.
it's interesting. I mean, my father is a doctor, so he always had he was the breadwinner and the practical one, and my mom is sort of like a Renaissance woman. She's an artist, and she
Okay.
researches, and she does all of these things, and she's still very is very engaged in academia and all of these pursuits. So they both were very supportive
That's
of my
great.
sister and I exploring anything we wanted to explore. At the same time, I wish that a little bit of practicality had been woven
Yeah.
in, right? Like,
Yeah.
I wish
Yeah.
there had been a class on
Yeah.
financial planning,
Yeah. Yeah.
or like something, right? Because it took me way too long, I think, to realize like how a credit card worked, and
Yeah, I get it. I
how
have
to
to
be a human.
confess
Yeah.
that I'm working on a novel for the first time in my life, and it's because between my father passing away and then being a single parent, I always had a somewhat practical feel of like nonfiction's easier to sell, and I could spin it off as magazine articles. Sometimes I'd be on assignment, and some of them would turn into sections of books. So I always had to be a little bit practical. At the time, I thought these events were bad for my life. They turned out to be extremely good for me as a writer, because I lost that holier than thou. Well, I'll just wait for 10 years until I get this perfect thing finished. It's like, I got to get this finished. I mean, I need to get an advance for this book or I'm toast. And that really happened to me when I left DC and came to Connecticut. And I mean, I had to come up with X amount of money to make the move. And
Mhm.
and I was like, I got to get this done. And so there was something of value in moving away from, I was really a flighty kid, reader and writing plays, and to, okay, if I've got to be grounded sometimes.
Mhm.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No,
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And I think finding ways to make a living as a writer, because it is possible. I think maybe not with your debut novel
No,
necessarily,
that's right.
but
That's right.
editing or
Yes.
writing feature articles for a
Yes.
publication, that sort of thing, which
There's a lot of
Yeah.
writing for hire,
There
actually. There's a
absolutely-
ton. I
yeah.
couldn't believe it when I went to Washington, D.C. There's a ton of writing for hire.
Mhm.
McGraw-Hill contacted me, blah, blah, blah. Will you do this? Oh my gosh, tons of work for hire where they're churning out. Like, I did a young adult history series for Grolier that used to be in Connecticut. And, the key for that was to just believe in yourself as a writer. So when they came to you, do you know anything about the Spanish-American War? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know all about it.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, here's the assignment. And you're like, okay, let me research. Because you
Yeah.
would believe in yourself as a writer that you could handle whatever task they had given you.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
that was actually kind of funny. I had to pull that off a couple of times. Oh, yeah, I know exactly.
Oh
I
yeah.
did a book on the Wright brothers, which I'm really proud of, with National Geographic for the Centennial Flight. And they came to me, and I've been trying for years to break into that division, and I had failed. And they were like, the writer backed out. He was a pilot and a writer. We really need this for Centennial, and you have, a year to do it. And, what do you know about flight? No problem. And I was like, I know absolutely nothing about flight. But I had a cousin who was a pilot. So I talked to them, and, but so I fudged it a bit. I was like, yeah, I can do that. But that was also because you believe in yourself and your writing. So that's the cool thing about always writing, because then you get good at it. And then when you get good at it, you can keep empowering yourself that way. That because writing pops up in so many aspects of your life. You don't just use it for your short story, you use it everywhere.
And some of that work, as you said, can feed into
It
your
does.
creative work.
It does.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm amazed that you have created a business, writing, editing, doing your own work, a lot of editing for hire. Can you just talk for a minute here about the ratio
Oh
of like
God.
what ratio is like mostly edit for hire? You know what I mean? Like what
Mhm.
percentage is still your creative time?
I think it depends on the day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which
Okay.
which is sort of a non-answer. but
Hopefully your daughter isn't sick.
My
and-
daughter,
yeah.
exactly. Like some days it's 100% my daughter,
Yeah.
and then some days it's 75% writing and 15% my daughter. And some days if it's a teaching day, it'll be 50% teaching and 10% writing and 20% daughter. And I don't think
How do you handle that emotionally as a writer?
Probably not very well.
We're flipping roles here, but I'm
I know.
genuinely interested.
I know.
Right? Like how
Yeah.
emotionally, how do you handle like, oh, I thought I was going to work on my short story today, but my teacher gave me a huge assignment and I can't, right?
Mhm.
And it's like, it's easy to get discouraged.
It is. It is.
I think it's one of the key things to learn to cope with, right?
Yes.
Like you're like,
yeah.
okay, it just didn't happen today, and don't get too discouraged.
I think so.
Right.
And I think momentum
Yeah,
is part of
mhm,
it, where,
mhm.
and I wonder if you feel this way too, because you likewise have a lot of things going on, where I think I've finally reached, maybe almost reached a stage where I know if I can't write during a day, I'm still a writer. And there
Oh,
used to
that's
be this
great.
feeling of like,
Yeah.
oh God, if I can't write today, it means I'm not a writer. I suck. I'll never create anything. And I think now I've created enough things, and
I
I've
love
created a
that.
world
That's
around
great.
writing where if I can't write today, I'm like,
Beautiful.
I'm still a writer.
That's good closure.
Yeah.
I really like that.
I like that too.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I'm almost there.
Yeah.
I don't always get there. Yeah.
Interject here. It's almost 6 o'clock, but I wanted to add to your point about just creativity. I have a master's in fine arts. I'm a
Oh.
graphic designer.
Oh, neat.
And my daughter dances. My family plays music, but it's interesting because what I always told myself and told them is that you never stop being the dancer, the writer, the musician. That's always a part of you.
Mm-hmm.
And some days you have stuff to say, some days you don't have stuff to say. I found out that I've actually been creative my entire life, even though I took a break to raise my children.
Mm-hmm.
But the way I raised them was creative.
That's a
the
wonderful way to look at
environments
it.
we had around us was created. I may not have produced artwork,
Mhm.
but it was in our lives.
A sensibility.
Yes,
You
exactly.
generated
So
a sensibility.
I think even
Yeah.
if we don't end up making a living as an artist selling that painting, you are making a living as a result of being a creative person.
Beautiful.
If that makes sense.
Totally.
Absolutely.
So
Great.
I think everyone needs to kind of like take a breath, take the pressure off themselves.
Yes.
Just know that you're always a writer.
Mm-hmm.
You're always a mom.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that monster creeps in. But,
Yeah,
you know,
always a monster. Oh
but you're
no.
always
The
these
monster
things.
creeps
It's
in.
just,
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we're having a sensibility crisis as a country, and that it lies in culture. I recently went to a fundraiser for the Ukraine, and I thought it was so moving that it was their culture they turned to. They stood on the stage and read poems, and they sang their songs. And that is a thing of beauty that they knew, well, what we need to do is return to our culture and our sensibility as a people. It was really beautiful.
But
Yeah.
as we sit here in the middle of the library where there are works of nonfiction, a lot of creativity that kind of runs through here and that we house and we share with people. I think the fact that in our everyday lives we touch some form of art, it's very important as
Beautiful.
well. We're sitting
Yeah.
in a structure that is architectural beauty. We're sitting surrounded by works of art with with words and with pictures and with design. So I think as a society, back to the rubric that you were talking about, I do find myself saying to the kids, they're college age, what does the rubric say? Because that's how they've always
Mm-hmm.
been graded. But at the end of the day, how are you satisfied with the work that you do?
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
Yes.
So it's
Absolutely.
kind of this really interesting dynamic of feeding that creative part and understanding that you have a voice,
Yeah.
and then also kind of playing by the rules. It's a very hard kind of line to walk.
Yes.
And I don't know, in
Yeah.
education, my father's a professor. He's a physics and math professor, so a little bit different. But there's a lot of creativity in that as well.
Yeah.
A lot of writing
Yeah.
and-
Thanks for sharing all that. It was wonderful. No, it's actually really, really lovely because it shows you it's not just writing, it's all the arts. And
Mm-hmm.
So we're surrounded
Yeah,
by art all
yeah.
the time. It's just don't I have colleagues that will say, not colleagues here, but in my artistic life, that will say, what are you painting? And I'm like, I'm not really painting anything, but boy am I doing a lot of creative work.
Mm-hmm.
That's
You
a
know,
wonderful
so
way to
it's
look at
just
it as a
kind of
mom,
like
especially, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
different way of
Yeah.
speaking part of your language.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
anyway,
No.
with that, I don't know if
Thank
want to, about 6 o'clock.
Yep.
Yep.
I don't know if anyone else has any questions. And
Sure. You can open it up. Any other questions? No?
whenever you're ready, if you want to wrap up, you can go as long as you want. I just don't want to.
No, we
I loved your closer there.
Okay.
So I
Yeah,
really
no,
love. Thank
we
you
can
for
wrap up.
listening, actually. It's very
Absolutely.
rewarding to chat about these things
Yeah.
because you realize that other people are thinking about them too. And it makes you feel less lonely in the work that you're doing. So I actually deeply appreciate even just being invited to talk with someone who cares about these things. So thanks for coming and thanks for this opportunity. It was really nice. Very nice. Thank you so
No.
much.
for
Great.
Thank you. And we'll say thank you, Mary, for
Oh,
being here, for driving
course.
down to
No,
be with
it's an
us.
honor.
And thank you to those in the audience here and to anyone watching at home. And then
Yeah, it's great.
anyone after the fact who's listening or watching the archived conversation. Thank you. And thank you finally to the
Yeah, the
Stonington Free
library.
Library.
Yay.
Yes.
Gotta love the library. Thank you.